Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's FAFSA training for those of you who help guide students throughout this process. I'm Adriana Pavicic, Community Engagement Coordinator at the Florida College Access Network. Many thanks to our partners, Florida Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, Florida Office of Student Financial Assistance, and the Florida School Counselor Association, who worked collaboratively to make this training possible. And thank you so much for your hard work during these sessions. Before we get started with today's presentation, a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A feature on your dashboard to submit questions at any time. We have lots of FAFSA members working behind the scenes to answer them throughout this whole session. Also, this webinar is being recorded. We'll put a link to the recording on the Florida FAFSA Challenge page on the FCAN website in case you want to listen to it again later or share it with colleagues as well. And with that, let me welcome FAFSA President Nadine Bailey, who's going to help get us started with today's presentation and hand it off to our presenters. Welcome, Nadine, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Good morning, everyone. As she said, my name is Nadine Bailey, and I am the president of FAFSA. A little tidbit about FAFSA. We are a nonprofit organization in the state of Florida where we are comprised of financial aid professionals throughout the state, along with our business partners and other support staff that are part of our organization. We are so excited to continue our partnership with FCAN, as you can see by this webinar today. We have two great people who will be doing the training with you. I'm going to read a brief bio, and then we can start it right after that. Bear with as I switch screens. And nothing works until you want it to. So the first person we have presenting today is Daniel Barkowitz. And Daniel Barkowitz is an Assistant Vice President of Financial Assistance and Student Employment at the University of Miami, a position he has held since July of 2022. He is President-elect of the Southern Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, SASFA, and served as the inaugural chair of National Commission of the Certified Financial Aid Administrator, CFAA, program under the auspices of NASFA. And as the president of FAFSA, Daniel has served over 30 years in institutions of higher education. Previous roles include Director of Financial Aid at MIT, Dean of Financial Aid, Associate Dean of Student Affairs for Columbia College, and Columbia Engineering at Columbia University in the city of New York, Director of Operations and Training for the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority, and Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Boston College. Daniel earned his Bachelor's of Science in History from Northeastern University and his Master's of Education in Human Resource Education from Boston University. Daniel has led presentations on financial aid and college financing to many audiences, more than 750, ranging in size from 2 to 2,000. He has been interviewed for television, radio, and newspapers on the topic of financial aid. Daniel lives with his wife and 2 children in Orlando. He lives in Miami now too, and is a published poet, musical theater actor, and tarot card collector. He promises an enjoyable and informative presentation, and I can attest to that. And second, we have Dr. Karima Mansell. So Dr. Karima Campbell Mansell is an Associate Director of Financial Aid at the University of Central Florida. She started in financial aid as a work-study student in the Office of Student Financial Assistance at UCF. Innately passionate about helping others, working as student financial assistants appeared to be an appropriate career choice. As an Associate Director of Financial Aid, she is responsible for ensuring compliance for a variety of financial aid regulations. She also spearheaded the launch Sensible Nights financial literacy program for the university. Dr. Mansell is dedicated to assisting students and particularly passionate about breaking barriers to higher education access. In addition to her daily duties, she serves on a variety of committees. She truly enjoys speaking with students and their families about going to college through providing information to families of underrepresented and underserved students. Dr. Mansell hopes to assist students with breaking barriers to higher education attainment. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Mansell.
Good morning, everyone. So we are really excited to have this conversation about financial aid with you this morning. We do know that sometimes navigating financial aid can be complex, and there might be a little bit of angst as it relates to financial aid, and the whole purpose today is to have an informative and engaging conversation. Daniel and I have prepared some slides, and we're going to use that to guide the conversation, but ultimately this is your time, so we definitely want you to utilize the question and answer section so that we can get to as many specific questions that you may have. But before we get started, we want to know a little bit about the audience and who we're speaking with, and so we're going to go ahead and launch a few polls here to just garner a bit of information about you. So, Adriana, can you launch the first poll, please?
Yes, I'm just getting it started.
Thank you so much. And so,
oh, sorry, 1 second.
No worries. So to get started, we really just want to know, how long have you been doing this? How long have you been a high school guidance counselor? So if you're pretty new and you've been here 1 to 2 years or less than 2 years, please let us know that. 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, or more than 10 years.
What if I've been here for 5 years, but it feels like 10? What do I answer?
We're going to go with the actual amount of time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like it's slowing down, so I'll end the poll and share the results.
Oh, it's a mixed bag. So we have some new high school counselors, some seasoned high school counselors, and some people who've been doing this for quite some time. So it's a mix, and we thought that might be the case. So the presentation covers the gamut of the various aspects of financial aid. So we definitely want to have that baseline. Next poll, please.
Okay.
So again, we know that sometimes financial aid can be a little bit challenging to understand, and we recognize that we might have various comfort levels amongst the audience. So can you let us know just how comfortable you are? And you can be as honest and forthcoming as you would like. We definitely want to really know how you're feeling about financial aid and the financial aid process. And if you're ready to apply for a job, let us know.
Okay, looks like it's slowing down, so I'll end the poll and share the results.
All right, so the vast majority of you are somewhat comfortable with a few people being ready to apply for a job as a financial aid administrator. So our hope is that at the end of this presentation, you garner more comfort with the financial aid process and feel at least a little bit more comfortable than you were before we began. And lastly, we're going to launch a third poll. What do you find to be the most challenging aspect of helping students and families with the financial aid process? And it could be the lingo, misconceptions students and families may have about the process. We live in a very fluid world, but financial aid is oh so fluid and ever changing. So I know that for me, that's one of the things that I find most invigorating about my work, but also challenging about my work. And then there are a lot of processes. So we're just trying to figure out, what do you find to be the most challenging?
Okay, let me end the poll in a few more seconds. I'll share the results.
Misconceptions of students and families. Okay, financial aid is constantly changing. So vast majority of you are indicating, or the most votes went to the misconceptions of students and families. And so part of what we're doing, in addition to having sessions for our counselors, we will have quite a few sessions for students and families, helping them navigate the financial aid process, helping them navigate the FAFSA. So hopefully we get that information out there to assist you all with the work that you do. I am going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Daniel, who's going to start the presentation. And then I'll speak with you shortly and we will go from there.
Thanks, Karima. And I have to say, it's just a pleasure to spend time this morning with all of you. It's a real joy to do this presentation with Karima. She is a dear friend and colleague, and it's fun to have this conversation. As much as financial aid can be fun, and we hope we make financial aid fun for you today, learning a little bit about the financial aid process. Just a reminder, we're going to talk today about the fundamentals of how financial aid works for this upcoming admission year, which is the 23-24 admission year. What's interesting about this particular year is that we are in the precipice of a lot of change. So if you aren't aware, there are a couple of laws that were passed, the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2019 and the Coronavirus Response and Recovery Act of 2020/21 that made some pretty major changes to the way financial aid is going to be operating in the future. Those changes mostly impact the 24-25 year, but because we wanted to both highlight for you where the current process is, but also those things to watch out for that are changing in 24-25, we have this little button you'll see that says now featuring something new. So when we're talking about something that doesn't go into impact or effect until 24-25, you'll see that little button saying now featuring something new. The idea again is to highlight things because we know some of you may already be preparing for materials you're going to be sharing with this year's juniors or sophomores or first year students, freshmen. And we want to make sure that we're clear to you about what's changing, at least as much as we know right now that things are changing. So let's dive in. What are we going to talk? And by the way, I should also say, we will get you a copy of all of these slides. So feel free to take screenshots if you want to. But along with the recording on the FCAN webpage, we'll also post a download copy of the presentation for you. So you'll be able to access that as you would like to with copies of what we're talking about today. So today we're going to learn what financial aid is. We're going to talk about where does financial aid come from. We'll talk a little bit about when and how do students apply for financial aid. And finally, we'll cover unique circumstances. Things like, what do I do if I'm a DACA student or undocumented? What does it mean that I'm independent? What does it mean if my parents won't complete my FAFSA? We'll address all those issues as we go through this presentation today as well. So let's start with a bit of an overview. So what I would start by saying is there is some good news, right? That there is a lot of funding available in financial aid nationwide. And these data I'm going to share with you come from the College Board's annual publication, Trends in Student Aid. This is the 2021 edition. We haven't yet published, or they haven't yet published the 21-22 data, but you can see that in the school year 2020 to 21, there was over $186 billion given out in undergraduate financial aid. I will say that is exclusive of, or it does not include, the emergency money that was given out in CARES grant funds. So we also got supplemental funding to help with what was going on because of the coronavirus situation, COVID-19 situation. So this $186 billion is just the base financial aid source, or the base amount that was given out. You can see, if you look at the chart as well, sort of how that's broken up. So if you start at the 12 o'clock position of the pie chart, you can see federal grants, that's mostly Pell, but not exclusively, is about 14%. Veterans benefits about 5%. And you can read the rest of the chart. What is also good news is that the story for many years has been that student loans are a problem, they're a nightmare for families, and I'm not downplaying that. For many families and many students who borrow too much, it is a problem. But the good news is that over time, actually, as a percentage of aid, student loans has actually been reducing. So if you go back and look historically, nationwide, student loans have actually been reducing as a percent of the total amount of financial aid that's out there. If you break this out into the individual types of funding, grants, or scholarships, or VA veterans benefits that are not repayable, versus loans, versus work, versus tax benefits, you'll see that grants are the overwhelming majority of what's available for families. That said, still 30% of the funding nationwide is in the form of loans. But you can see that grants and scholarships are a significant percentage of the funding available. And I will also say the piece that I think families get confused about often is where grants are coming from. There's a large understanding about federal grants, Pell Grant. We hear a lot about Pell Grant. In Florida, we hear a lot about Bright Futures, and you can see state grants represent 7% of all the money available in the form of funding. But if you look at the total of all grants, about half of it comes from institutions like UCF, where Karima is, or University of Miami, where I am, or at Valencia College, where I used to work. Institutions put in a significant portion of grant funding for their students as well. And in fact, if you look at the sources, right, institutions are the second largest source of funding after the federal government. This is important for you to understand and for families to understand for this reason. Often I find that families forget about satisfying the requirements that institutions have for their own funding. You want to make sure that when a family applies for financial aid, they don't forget the second largest funding source, and that is those institutions. And we'll talk as we go through about what that looks like from an application perspective. I'll also say, by the way, Karima, feel free to unmute and weigh in as we go through. If there's anything you want to add on any slide as we go along.
Absolutely.
Great. And Adriana, if we have questions you want me to address as well, feel free to jump in. So with that, the last thing I'll say is, I know this feels overwhelming. This is a manageable process. You have lots, you serve as one of the forms of assistance, but even for you, we are here in the financial aid office as your partner to help get this message out to families. And so we stand ready to assist you. FAFSA stands ready to assist you as an association, FCAN as well. So that's the other message I try to get out to families, is that this can feel overwhelming, but it is a manageable process. So the other question I think that's really important to address is the "is it worth it" question. When I talk with families, I do highlight this slide because families get concerned about the cost of college and how much college is these days. And there is an economic payout question that I think is important to address as well. And you'll see here on the slide, these are data that come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that show average weekly earnings and the unemployment rate in 2021 based on educational level. So the higher someone gets on the educational ladder, right, the higher their wages on a weekly basis on average, and the lower their risk of unemployment is. And so, I share this with families and with you because I think this is, again, a really important foundation to explain the economic benefit of college attendance. And if that doesn't make the argument, then this chart certainly will. You have a static picture on the 2021 chart I just shared, but this shows you over time what's happened to unemployment rates. And you can see that every time we've had a crisis, look at 2018 with what happened with the Great Recession. Look at 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic, and you can see that unemployment rates spike high among those who have less than a high school diploma and don't recover as quickly. But those with a bachelor's degree and higher, unemployment rates, while they spike, generally have a much faster recovery time frame. And in fact, unemployment rates among those with a bachelor's degree and higher were, as of August 2022, already back to pre-pandemic levels, where you might or might not be able to say that for each of those populations. So again, I think it's really important to share these data with families as well. Okay, so moving on, let's talk a little bit about some simple vocabulary. So when you work in the financial aid world, there are a couple of pieces you need to know. One of them is COA. COA stands for cost of attendance. So that is how much it costs for a family to attend an institution for the year. That would include things like tuition and fees, housing, meals, books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. When I present to families, one of the first questions I ask is, what are some colleges you're thinking about? And so they'll shout out places like UCF or UMiami or Valencia. And I'll say, okay, so what does it cost to attend that institution? And they'll provide me a number that is often the tuition and fees amount. For example, at University of Miami, our tuition amount is $54,000 a year. That's just our tuition and fees, right? But when you put a budget together that includes housing, meals, books, supplies, everything, the actual total cost of attendance is about $78,000. I know that's a lot, but not every family coming through is paying that. In fact, most families are not paying that amount. But we have to start with a measure of what the family cost is going to be for a year, and that is that cost of attendance. What gets subtracted from the cost of attendance then is what's called the expected or estimated family contribution, right? The EFC. So the EFC is a measure of what a family can afford to pay, and we determine that by analyzing the FAFSA, or in some cases, a supplemental application we'll talk about called the profile. But we determine how much a family can contribute toward that cost of attendance based on that EFC. So we have the cost of attendance, we have the EFC, and the difference between them is what your need is or your eligibility for financial aid. It's what you as a student, or what your students could qualify for in total financial aid, need-based. Again, need-based aid based on that difference between the cost and the EFC. Okay, so here's our first highlight of something new or something different. Starting in 24-25, so not this coming year, but for the year that your juniors will be applying for college, all of that language is changing. And in fact, we are moving away from the EFC to something called the Student Aid Index. That's going to be the name of what the new index is called. And it actually means something different. It's going to be used as a measure to look up Pell eligibility. Fundamentally, the core concept here is remaining the same, but as you start preparing your materials for your juniors and below, you should start thinking about your naming, your nomenclature, to change EFC to SAI, or Student Aid Index. Next year, we'll come through and do another whole presentation about the changes for 24-25, I'm sure. And at that point, we'll dive into more detail about how the SAI is changing. And again, if you want to get some updated information, follow FAFSA through the years. We give more information out as we get it from the federal government. But it's important to know that these things are changing. You'll also see on the bottom of some of these slides, and I meant to highlight this before, this thing that says learn more. Moneyman blog is a blog that I've kept over time with, it's a little out of date at this point, but it's got some good historical information about what's going on in financial aid. Feel free to link to that, to read it. It'll give you more information than we can cover in our presentation this morning. Okay, so moving on. What is the cost of attendance? So here are some sample costs of attendance over a number of institutions, some of whom I know we have people on the call from, but this gives you a sense of sort of what the different costs are. So Karima, let's look at UCF together, right? So at UCF, and I pulled this right off of UCF's webpage, you can see they're the second one here, and they've got 4 costs. Do you want to explain a little bit about why there might be 4 different costs?
Sure.
On our chart?
At state colleges and state universities, we take into account a variety of factors when determining the cost of attendance. That includes the student's residency status, because at state colleges and universities, a student who is out of state has a different tuition rate than a student that is in state. And then we're also looking at the student's housing status. Those students who live on or off campus versus those students who live with parent or relative will have a different cost of attendance. So those are the variety of different levels that you're seeing here with the cost of attendance. And we're basing cost of attendance in this instance on full-time enrollment, but if a student's enrollment is not full-time, then cost of attendance will be adjusted accordingly.
And one thing to say, especially at UCF, right, is there's a $15,000 subsidy that you're getting per year by being an in-state resident, which is not nothing. I mean, again, that, families don't think about that necessarily as a financial aid source. But that difference between sort of the in-state and out-of-state tuition is really massive. And as a reminder, for Florida residency, you have to establish residency a full year before attending college to qualify to be an in-state resident. Those requirements vary state by state. So if you're advising someone who's going to a different state, just be aware that every state has their own residency requirements. You can come and look at right, University of Miami, and you'll see here at we have 2 costs, one for off-campus, living with relatives, and one for either on or off-campus, living independently. And again, that makes a difference in our cost setup as well. So you can see over time sort of where this goes. Okay, so moving on then, how does that work once we get this formula together? So we have the cost, we have the EFC, what's going to become the SAI, And then we have this need. So let's say as a student, I'm applying to 5 different colleges, right? And they vary in cost from $70,000 at the high end to $10,000 at the low end. When I apply to colleges, I might think, well, it's too expensive for me. I'm not going to apply to the $70,000 school because the cost is out of my reach. But what this chart is showing you is that in reality, if your EFC in this example is 10,000, right, your eligibility for financial aid is the remainder. So assuming the student gets all the financial aid they would qualify for, which is an assumption, but let's assume that for the moment, the student would be able to pay 10,000, or the family would, at any of these colleges, and the rest of those funds would come in the form of financial aid to assist the family in paying the remainder of the cost. So it's an important piece to, again, understand in terms of the practical application of the formula and the way this works. So moving on, let's just summarizing this section. I think what's important to remember is that price doesn't equal cost, right? So the price is what the sticker price is. That's their cost of attendance for schools. But the net price for families is the difference. It's that cost minus whatever financial aid they're going to be receiving. And in fact, for a lot of families, what may be helpful is to advise them, especially for juniors and younger, to look at college's net price calculators. So federal government several years ago required every university and college in the country to publish on their webpage a net price calculator. That is usually on the admissions or financial aid page. And a family can go in and punch in just a couple of pieces of information about income, about assets, about number in the family, and they get a rough estimate of what their family contribution and their financial aid award might be. So this link here, collegecost.ed.gov/net-price, has a link to every net price calculator in the country. And again, great resource for students to take a look and see, can I afford to go to University of Miami? Can I afford to go to University of Florida? What is the cost going to be for me and my family? Now, this may not include merit aid. It may, but it helps families on average determine the affordability college by college. So it's a great tool for families. So as we talk about affordability, it's important to understand that, again, financial aid is 3 kinds of things. It's grant or scholarships, money that doesn't have to be repaid. It's loans, obviously student loans right now with the whole provision for cancellation and forgiveness. There's a lot of conversation about student loans, and we can certainly get into that later if there are questions about that. But student loans are part of the financial aid package that a school is going to put together for an individual student, right? That's number one. And then, in terms of loans. And then the last piece is a work award. So many families and students will be awarded what's called work study, the opportunity to earn money in a job on campus. That usually doesn't subtract directly from the bill, but it helps give the student some money to spend for personal expenses or other expenses that are part of that EFC. So again, financial aid is made up of all 3 of those sources, and we saw that in that first chart. Okay, so let's talk about what applications family might need to do. So Karima, I'm going to ask if you want to come back on for a second, and let's do something fun. So
Sure.
So let's say you have a kid who's applying to college. You're not old enough, but let's say you did. So what colleges might they be considering applying to?
Well, I am 3 times a night, so I bleed black and gold. So I would hope that they apply to the University of Central Florida.
Okay, where else?
They may choose to look into a private institution, such as the University of Miami.
I like that. Okay.
My student might also want to start at a state college. And so we have a variety of different opportunities here in the Central Florida area. That could be anything from Valencia College to Seminole State or another surrounding state college.
So I'll put Valencia and Seminole on the list. So I've got 4 so far. And let's pick an out-of-state school.
I was going to go there. And so they might be interested in an out-of-state school. Let me see. Let's go with the University of Georgia.
Great. Okay. And if you don't mind, I will add a 6th, just to add a private out-of-state as well. Let's add, because this, your student has long wanted to live in Manhattan. I don't know why. So they're also going to think about NYU as a sixth college. Okay.
Sounds
so
good.
our question for all of you, and I'm not sure if you can put this in the chat, I would love that. But I'm curious to know what you think as the answer. What do you think is the number of financial aid applications? This is not a question for you, Karima, because you know the answer. But for those in the audience, how many financial aid applications do you think that someone in that situation, 6 colleges, would have to complete? What's the right number of financial aid applications? Let's make sure you all are playing along. So do they have access to the chat? Just a question. Do we know that?
Yes, they'll have access to the Q&A, not the chat.
Okay. So I hate to flood the Q&A, but we're going to do that. So just type in the Q&A what you think the right number of applications might be. Oh, Carol. Carol answered 18. Gosh, I hope not. So good guess. I see a lot of ones. Okay, remember we got 6 colleges. So what's the right answer? I'm looking down the list. I see 1, 2, 1 application, 2 to 4. Okay, so thank you for that. The right answer, by the way, and we'll stop with the Q&A responses now. For 6 colleges, the maximum number of applications is 9. So I'm going to talk about why that is. And Karima, if you want to help and play, you're welcome to.
Sure.
But let's go through. Actually, I'll give you an assignment, Karima. Every time I ask for a date, your assignment is to reply October 1st. Does that make sense?
I can do that.
Okay. So the first application, and for those of you who said 1, I'm sure you're thinking about this. The first application is the FAFSA, right? FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It is a free application. It is, when you use it, you don't pay a cost. Please be aware of that. Don't ever pay someone or have your families pay someone to do a FAFSA. It is required by every college in the country, and you fill out an application each year for each student who's attending college. So if I'm a parent, and at one point I did have 2 kids attending college, I did 2 FAFSAs that year, or they did, 1 for each student. And again, it's once per year per student. On that application, I list all colleges I'm applying to. Really important to understand, you don't have to be admitted to a college to apply on the FAFSA. In fact, you don't want to wait. Families don't want to wait. You want to encourage them to get that application in as soon as possible and list any college they're thinking about applying to. Now, here's the question, Karima. When does the application open for FAFSA?
October 1st.
You're right. So conveniently enough, 11 days, 12 days from now, right? We're doing this session today. October 1 is the launch date. Really important that students do this as soon as they can. While there's a lot of money in the system, colleges often prioritize limited resources to those who apply first. So the earlier you apply, the better. That's true at University of Miami for things like our Florida Student Assistance Grant, or our SEOG, which is another kind of grant reserved for Pell Grant students. We prioritize those who apply early. So the earlier families can apply, the better. And colleges have individual deadlines. You obviously want to make sure you meet those and students meet those deadlines. So FAFSA is the first. You can list up to 10 colleges on that first FAFSA. If you need to then add more, there's a process for that. We can talk to you about that. And you can look it up. It's fairly simple. You just replace the colleges that were listed on the first time with a correction for the second time. But again, you want to make sure to get that application process for families started as soon as possible after October 1, but definitely before the deadline for that individual school. So for Karima's pretend student, we've got 1 FAFSA where that student's going to list all 6 colleges. What's the second application? So the second application is something called the CSS Financial Aid Profile. That is a form that is only needed by colleges and universities that require it. There's a list of those colleges linked here in the link, and you can look up CSS Financial Aid Profile. Primarily, this is private, not-for-profit institutions that have significant resources of their own. So does UCF require the CSS profile, Karima?
We do not.
You do not. Does UM? Yes. So we do, right? Remember, we have a significant amount of financial aid institutionally. I have, within the institution, I have about $300 million I give out just an institutional grant every year to students and families to help reduce that $78,000 price tag. But to do that, I'm using the CSS financial aid profile to measure their eligibility to pay. It's a little more detailed than FAFSA and goes into a little more information than the FAFSA might. It is a paid form. However, it's free for families that earn less than $100,000 a year, but you do pay per college. Of the 6 colleges that Karima and I listed, the 2 that would require it are NYU and University of Miami. Any public college generally is not going to require it. Check to be sure, but that's a general rule of thumb. And again, you want to make sure that the family figures that out. With us, remember I said 31% of the money available nationwide is institutional grants. If that family doesn't do that CSS financial aid profile, they've automatically said, I don't want that institutional grant money. That's a big mistake for a family. So you want to make sure that they get that in. Hey, Karima, when does this application launch?
October 1.
You are brilliant. I mean, I knew that already, but yes. Yeah, October 1 is the launch date for that application. So we got 1 FAFSA, we've got 1 CSS profile. So far we're at 2. What's the next? By the way, both of those are done online electronically. So you'll see the links to the website. You can do them in paper form, but most families don't, and it makes it much more slow and difficult to do by paper. What is the third application? The third type of application is the institutional application. So here at what that means is that you have to tell us on your admissions app, yes, I want financial aid. If you don't, we will not track you. We will not follow you. We will not send you reminder letters. So that's all you have to do. But once you do that, we consider you for all the financial aid we might have available. Hey, at UCF, is there an application for scholarships or for anything else that students have to complete?
It's not a required application, but we do have a scholarship portal where students can complete a 1-page application to be considered for our institutional awards annually. As a part of our admissions process, all newly admitted students are considered for merit-based scholarships. But once a year, we do launch our Access to Opportunity Scholarship application.
Great. And at Valencia, I know the same. So at Valencia, there's a lot of money that's available from the foundation and from other organizations that partner with Valencia. But unless you complete that Valencia scholarship application, you won't be considered for that money. So while it's, to use your words, Karima, it is in fact optional, but I would strongly suggest that families do it because otherwise, again, you're not putting yourself into consideration for funding you might receive. So it's conceivable that, if a student's applying to 6 colleges, there may be an additional up to 6 applications. Now, some of that may be as simple as just saying, I want financial aid. Some of it may be more complicated with a form, but it's going to vary college by college. And again, families want to be sure that they make sure to research how that happens and what that is. And what date are those institutional scholarship applications usually, when do they usually go live? This is a trick question.
So this is not an October 1st answer. Right. It really depends on the institution. So this is really up to the student to figure out what that process looks like at their institution and the institutions they're most interested in attending, because there are times when the student can do that application process during their senior year to be considered for certain scholarships as well.
Yep. So
you didn't get me, Daniel.
I know you're two with it. So 1 FAFSA, 1 CSS profile, and up to 6 school applications. And then of course, we'll talk about the very last one, but here's what the FAFSA application page looks like when you log on to studentaid.gov. And then there's one more. So the last one, of course, is the Florida financial aid application. And I know you all know about this one as school counselors, but a reminder that that application opens when, Karima?
That application opens on October 1st.
It does. And a reminder that people generally refer to this as the Bright Futures application, but Florida has 15 different state scholarship grant and work programs. So Bright Futures is one of the largest, but it's not the only. Some of them are based on needs, some are not, but make sure that you get your application in that senior year as a high school student, because if not, you can't go back and change your mind later. This is one that you have to do, particularly during this time frame. I know most of you at your high schools, this is done either in the English class or the social studies class during their senior year. So there's a way for them to get access to this application. It's a very simple application, but it's important that families and students get this done during their senior year in high school. The other piece that I learned a couple of years ago, thanks to my good friend, Peter Hernandez, who I know is back there answering questions, I learned that if a student wants to go to someplace like a UM or a Valencia, they better make sure when they do their SAT or their ACT that they report their scores to a place like UCF or UF or USF, even if they're not thinking about applying to admissions there. The reason that's important is because the way the state gets its reports on SAT and ACT scores is by pulling them into a data mart, and that data mart is populated by reports given to the state universities. So even if a student doesn't want to go to a state university, they still need to report those test scores to one of the state universities to make sure if they're going to be Bright Futures eligible, that information is shared. Okay, so we're going to move quickly because I want to turn this over to you, Karima, as fast as I can because you've got good information to share. So how do people sign that FAFSA, right? So typically these days we're signing electronically. And you're going to use a parent or student, what's called an FSA ID, Federal Student Aid ID. It's a combination of a username and a password. And you do have to have one as a student and a different one for the parent. It's the same one for your lifetime. So if you're a parent and you did a FAFSA for a different student, you can use the same FSA ID for this coming student. But you do have to register that. You can either register ahead of time, so families can do this now, or they can register for that FSA ID as part of their annual process for signing up for the FAFSA. But for students, it then becomes their ID to sign their promissory notes, to do their entrance counseling, to do other things related to their student loans. And here's a picture of that FSA ID webpage. You can see a combination of a username or a phone number, mobile phone number, and a password. Okay, so what information do you need to have in terms of getting ready to complete the FAFSA? So as a family, you want to make sure that you sit down with the following information, and this is a good list to share with your students, of what information is required to go ahead and prepare to enter into the FAFSA. Copies of tax forms and other information, child support paid. You can see your state issued identification like your driver's license, your social security number, etc. What's also important is to understand, and we've talked a little bit about this, there were some questions about this that came through, is what do you do if you're in a divorced or separated situation? So I want to highlight for families that you work with where there is a divorce or separation. This is another thing that's going to be changing in the next year or so. So for right now, for families that are divorced or separated, the family that completes the FAFSA is the family that's considered the custodial household. That means, where does the student spend most of their time? If, let's say, mom and dad are divorced, student lives with mom during the academic year, but dad during the summer. In that situation, the mom, regardless of income, regardless of tax status, regardless of anything else, mom would be the custodial parent and filling out the FAFSA for this year. If mom and dad share custody equally, so literally half and half, 3.5 days, 3.5 days, then the question becomes, who provides more financial support? So if dad gives more money to the student than mom does, or pays more expenses than mom does, then it's dad. If it's mom who pays more, then it's mom. But that's only once the first question is answered. Where does the child live? In the current environment as well, there are some colleges, UM is one of them, where we then ask the other parent to give us information for our money, not for federal money, for our money. For the federal government, it's solely based on the custodial family today, right? But for private institutions, we might consider the other parent. And that is true at UM. We don't believe that divorce necessarily frees you of the obligation to pay for your child's education. So we collect information on that second parent as well. But that is a college by college choice for their money. Federal money, that is not true. Here's a big change that's coming. Starting in 24-25, this is all changing. So in 24-25, the parent who completes the FAFSA will be the one who gives more money towards a child expenses. That's really important for families who are applying for college now, because that will mean that first year, it might be one parent, sophomore, junior year, senior year, it might be a different parent who completes the FAFSA. So as you work with divorced and separated families, you want to highlight this for them, that right now it's based on custodial, but coming forward, that is changing to which parent gives the most money or pays the most expenses for that student. Okay, let's move quickly through the dependent.
Daniel,
yeah.
Can we back up on parents just one more nugget here? And just to be very clear, for the purposes of the FAFSA, a parent is either a biological, adoptive, or step parent. Students who are in a guardianship, we have students with different types of familial situations. Those individuals do not necessarily qualify as a parent for the purpose of the FAFSA. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. That's really important. So a grandparent is never a parent, for example, right? Unless they've legally adopted the student. But guardianship, as an example, is a condition of independence. So a legal guardianship situation, there'd be no parent information reported. And your point is really valid about the household. It's not the parent, it's the household we're looking at. So that might include step parents, it might include partners living together, et cetera. It's based on that household. Thank you for that. The other thing that's important to understand is what constitutes independence. So, and I know we had a question about this before the webinar as well. So how do I determine if I'm dependent or independent? What's the answer there? So if a student can answer yes to any of these questions, then they'll be considered independent and parental information will not be required. And you can look down the list of questions, and most of them, were pretty obvious. We talked about guardianship, but included in that is, are you married? Are you over 24? Are you working on a PhD or master's? Do you have kids of your own that you support? Are you an emancipated minor or in legal guardianship, homeless or at risk of homelessness? In those situations, students are automatically independent. What happens, though, for students who have a unique situation? Let's say in that situation, maybe there's abuse and neglect in the household, or maybe mom and dad are in California, a student moved to Florida to get away from a really bad home situation. In those situations, the individual student needs to appeal to a financial aid officer to declare what's called an independent override. And that's solely up to the judgment of the individual financial aid officer, whether they will grant that or not. Typically, there's a high standard of proof here. So it's not simply, I don't want to do this. My parents don't want to fill out the FAFSA. Typically, it's got to be something more substantial than that. It needs to be documented, often with a third-party notice, something from an uninterested party to prove out that situation. What do I do if I still can't get my parents' information? Those students can fill out the FAFSA without parent information, but generally they'll be limited to unsubsidized loans only. They won't qualify for the full suite of financial aid. Now, I missed this, but here's another thing that's changing, by the way. Starting in 24-25, students will be able to complete the FAFSA without parental information, but they will be in what's called provisional independent status, and they'll need to follow up with the financial aid officer to document their condition. So it won't be rejected, but it will be in a provisional status that won't allow the aid to move forward without a follow-on conversation with the aid officer. Okay, what year's information am I using? So remember that when October starts, next month, the only tax information we have at that point is last year's tax information. So for the entire year of 23-24, the attendance year, we're using the 2021 tax information. That is how we're basing our financial aid decision. When families file the FAFSA, they're going to use their 21 information, their current assets, but their 21 income information. Now, what happens if that income is dramatically different? Karima will talk about that in her section about how to appeal in those situations. So I'll leave that there, but just for the moment, note that you're paying the bill as a family in August of 23, but it's based on income typically that was earned from January to December of 21. This couple of years has been tumultuous for many families. So, we know that there's been a lot of income loss, and we'll talk about how do we work with families in that situation. The other thing I'll say is, the way this works is your income information, family's income information, can be currently transferred from the IRS directly to the FAFSA. When you log in, you have an option to link directly to the FAFSA and get that information transferred over. Moving forward, starting in 24-25, parents and students won't have a choice. when they log into the FAFSA, they will have to link up to the IRS in order to complete the FAFSA. So for right now, it's an option. We highly recommend it because we want to minimize the number of students who are selected for what's called verification. And by linking your IRS data directly to the application, families can eliminate or reduce, not eliminate, but reduce the likelihood that they will be selected for verification. But just a quick review about that. What is verification? So about a third, it's a little less these days, but about a third of students are selected for what's called verification. In that scenario, families have to prove what they put on the FAFSA. If they didn't link to the IRS, the college may ask them to submit a copy of their IRS forms. We may have what's called a verification form where they list the members of their household. Some students are selected in what's called proof of identity or a V4 status. So we need to collect a copy of a statement of educational purpose. They have to prove their identity or their immigration status or prove they're a high school graduate. So about a third of our students nationwide are selected for that kind of verification. Starting in 24-25, it's going to look very different because, as I said, students will have to log into the IRS system first to do their FAFSA. We're waiting to hear how that's going to look, but it's likely just going to be proof of identity, and we imagine the numbers selected will be much reduced.
Daniel, can I just chime in on verification for one moment?
Please.
I noticed that some of our high school counselors have been doing this for a while, so you may have heard that verification has been waived for the 2021 and 21-22 year. That is not necessarily going to be the case for 22-23. So I just wanted to kind of put that in the conversation because verification is for the upcoming year. We might be seeing a little bit more of that until we see those changes take effect. So while we're kind of in flux with verification, we've gotten waivers for the last 2 years. We don't know if that will be the case in subsequent years while we wait for the 24-25, or I should say 23-24, I'm sorry, while we wait for the 24-25 changes to take place. So just be mindful that some of your students still might be undergoing this process while we're in this transition.
And I would also echo by saying, remember that just because federal verification is waived, that doesn't mean institutions will waive their verification. So again, at UM, even though federal verification has been waived for this year and last year, we actually are collecting tax returns from everyone to prove out our financial aid for the money we're giving away. So, again, you want to make sure to confirm with the student, have the student confirm with the school what's going on and what their status is.
Right.
Okay. So let's move on to merit or need. And then I do promise, Karima, we're almost there. I got 3 slides and I'm turning this over to you. So how does the money get awarded? So really important to understand that overall, most money that's awarded nationwide is given away in the form of need-based aid. That's not to say that there's a lot of money given away in athletic aid or academic aid, what we call merit aid. But, and again, in Florida, what's the biggest merit aid program we know about? Bright Futures, right? Bright Futures is not based on a family's need, but most of the money given out is based on need. So really important as families think about their application process, they realize that the likelihood of getting merit-based aid is higher, frankly, if they apply to a college or university where they're a star, where they're going to be a recruit who the college or university wants to enroll. And so when I talk with families, I highlight the difference between merit aid and need-based aid. And I talk about approaches where some colleges look at merit to sweeten financial aid packages, and also say to families that, I know as counselors, you often talk about an admissions safety school and a reach school, right? Where it's maybe a dream for the kid to attend that college. It's an academic reach. I would also advise thinking about a school or a college or university where the student is the reach for that college or university, right? Make sure that in the mix of colleges students are applying to, there's a school where they will be a standout star. And that will give the student an opportunity perhaps to have a merit-based package in the mix as well. So think about that for families as they think about the combination of schools that they wish to apply to. And we're going to do something. I'm actually going to skip this because we're running short on time. But let's move to sort of our financial aid barrel, and then I'm going to turn this over to Karima for her section. So So how do we put this financial aid all together? So I want you to think about us sitting in our offices surrounded by barrels. And at Karima's office, that barrel may cost, $21,000 to fill up, or if you're coming from out of state, maybe it's closer to $33,000. But her job is to put the coins in the barrel to fill up the barrel to help families pay for college. My job at is it's a bigger barrel, right? It's a $78,000 barrel. So my job is to fill up my barrel. And each student comes through as a barrel. We have to figure out how to fill up that money. And the example here, the sort of the thought experiment, if you will, is what is the first thing to go into that barrel? Well, the first thing is that family contribution. So in this example, we've got a family who's got a $25,000 cost with a $5,000 EFC and $20,000 of need. So the first source of money we're going to put in is that EFC, that $5,000 for need-based aid. What comes next? Next typically would be the gift award. So in this situation, they got a $6,800 scholarship and a $7,000 grant. So filling up more of the barrel. What comes next is what we in financial aid called self-help. So the work and loan contribution that a student may make to help themselves fund their education. So in this case with the student, it's about $4,700 between the work and loan award. In this particular example, this student was left with room in their barrel, or what we call unmet need. So if this family were to come to this institution with this barrel, this package, right, their cost would be the $5,000 plus their unmet need of $1,500 because there's room left in the barrel. I'll say there are some schools that commit to meeting the full need of every student. I know UCF tries to do that as well. We at have a guarantee that every admitted freshman, we're going to meet the full need of each of those students coming through. So we will fill up the barrel in every case for those students. We'll meet their full need. If this family were to go out and get an outside scholarship, right, what would be the first thing reduced? Let's say they got a $2,000 reward from the high school or from some other foundation. The first $1,500 generally would come from that unmet need, right? That's going to be the first thing to be replaced. The last thing to be replaced will be that family contribution because it's all the way at the bottom of the barrel. This is important for families to understand. When families qualify for an outside scholarship, often there's an assumption that's going to reduce their out-of-pocket. That won't necessarily unless it reduces their unmet need. It might reduce next the work or loan award, but it's usually not going to touch that EFC in this case until this family got a $20,000 outside scholarship. There'd be no reduction to what that family would pay out of pocket. So with that, Karima, I'm going to turn this over to you then to move us into the sort of unusual situations and some insider tips and
Sure.
How do you pay in your EFC?
So I know that when I'm counseling students and families, a lot of times the expected family contribution can seem jarring. It doesn't seem like something that they're able to do realistically. So how do students and families make up the expected family contribution? So one way is past income, if there's savings or available resources for that family, then present income such as salary and payment plans, and then future income such as loan programs. And there are a variety of different loan programs available to students and families. We have loan programs where the student is the borrower, such as the federal unsubsidized and subsidized loans. There are private educational loans where students are responsible for doing their research and determining if there's a private educational lender that works well to suit their needs. And then there are parent loans. So parents can serve as the borrower for our undergraduate students with the Parent Plus loan. And that allows parents to borrow on behalf of the students up to the student's unmet cost of attendance. So some insider tips. There are a variety of different dates and a variety of different deadlines that students have to be aware of. Of course, we talked a lot about October 1st and October 1st being when the FAFSA launches, but each and every school has what they call a priority filing date. And that priority filing date varies from one institution to the next. And so it's a lot to keep up with. So we encourage our students and we encourage you to encourage students to create a matrix and a financial aid file where they keep copies of what they've sent and they keep track of dates that are approaching. We also encourage our students and encourage you all to be there for our students because there's a lot of questions that they may have, and we want them to have a safe place to ask those questions. And there are a lot of events. I know that we'll be hosting quite a few high school nights in the coming weeks here. And I know that there are other institutions doing the same. I know that our state agency also works very closely with a lot of the financial aid administrators throughout the state to ensure that high schools and high school students are getting the support they need to navigate this process. So we do want students to have a variety of different outlets and places where they can ask those complicated questions and get the answers to the questions they need. We encourage students to not rule out a school just because of cost. However, keeping cost as a part of the decision-making process. But as Daniel mentioned, there are a variety of different ways to pay for college. And in some instances, students may be able to get a financial aid package comprehensive enough that even though that school might have a high cost of attendance, that school can become in the student's financial reach. And then just to explore all the different financing options. Not all of our students are going to be eligible for need-based aid such as grants. However, the ball is in students' court when it comes to the scholarship search process. We want to encourage students to apply for any and all scholarships for which they meet the criteria. We want them to get as much free money as possible. I like to say free money is good money. So we definitely want to encourage them to be diligent and tenacious in the scholarship search process. And because sometimes students get a little discouraged if they don't get those first few scholarships for which they apply, but it is really a long game. So we want to continue to encourage students to look for all their different options, including scholarships. So just a reminder of where financial aid comes from. The federal government, some of the more prominent or popular programs that we hear about when it comes to the federal government is the federal Pell Grant. But as I mentioned, students don't have much control over whether or not a student qualifies for the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is going to be based on the expected family contribution. Other federal programs include our federally funded student loan programs and other federal grants, such as the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. This is where filing by a school's priority deadline comes into play because there are times when there are limited resources, and we want to ensure that students maximize their financial aid package. So again, we want to encourage students to know the priority deadline of the schools they're interested in attending. State government is another resource and tool available to students in terms of financial aid. As Daniel mentioned, in Florida, probably the most common state program we talk about is our Florida Bright Futures program, but there are a variety of state programs, including the Florida Student Assistance Grant, the Florida EASE grant for those students attending private institutions. So there are a variety of different state programs available to students. Colleges and universities, we all have institutional funds that we're giving to students to assist with the cost to come to our various institutions. But students should also look at private agencies such as their civic groups in the area, such as the Rotary, Elks, religious groups such as churches, synagogues. There are a variety of different resources within the community where students can find resources to assist them with going to college. I always like to encourage students to apply for all scholarships, meaning even if that scholarship is only $250, sometimes it doesn't seem like it's worth it. The scholarships are typically stackable. So we're looking at trying to maximize your financial aid package and looking at the variety of different awards that a student can potentially attain. So we definitely want to take an assessment of all those various resources available, professional associations, Greek letter organizations. There's so many different places where students can find funds. And in some cases, students can reach out to maybe their employer in some instances or their parents' employer to assist with tuition assistance. So back to the scholarship search. There is money out there. And so a lot of times students wonder, is there money out there? There is money out there. And a lot of times money gets left on the table because students don't apply for it. Can they get any of it? Absolutely. We want to encourage our students to think about what makes them a good scholarship candidate. And that's everything from their academic performance to their civic involvement, to what they have done to cultivate their interests academically and professionally, how they are involved in the community. So we definitely want students to think outside of the box when it comes to looking for scholarships. Not all scholarships are solely based on GPA and academic performance. I am a proponent of FastWeb. It is a simple process for students to really tap into a variety of different scholarship opportunities. There are so many scholarships out there. Students set up a profile using their unique email address, and essentially they will get the opportunity to apply for scholarships for which it looks like they meet the criteria. I encourage students to always be ready with some information on hand. So I call it your scholarship template, where you just kind of outline a few things about you as a student. And then when you are wrapping up and getting your essay ready for that particular application, then making sure that you're meeting all of the points that particular donor is requesting and applying for all of those scholarships. And then each school typically has their own scholarship application process. As I mentioned at UCF, ours is called Access to Opportunities, or A2O, but each school has its platform that students should become familiar with, and students should definitely look at any school that they're interested in attending, look at what that scholarship process looks like at that institution. Next slide. So the financial aid calendar, October 1st, FAFSA becomes available, the CSS profile becomes available. November 1st is early college decision deadlines. You also want to ensure that students are continuing with the process and completing all forms that are being requested. In December, early decisions are mailed for some institutions. Also in December through February, you're going to start to see a lot of deadlines approaching. So it's really important for students to, again, keep that matrix and keep track of all of the documentation that they need to submit to the various schools that they're interested in attending. In late February, schools start to ask additional questions. Some schools may call, other schools may utilize their portal or platform at that institution so that students know what it is that they need to submit. And at the end of March, early April, you start to see financial aid and admissions information be mailed to students. In financial aid, we refer to the comprehensive collection of financial aid awards that a student is receiving as the financial aid package. When a student receives his or her financial aid package, it's important for them to look at a variety of different factors. And those factors include the cost associated with that institution, the type of aid the student is getting at that institution. And Daniel mentioned using the net price calculator. We do want our students to look at their financial aid packages comprehensively. It is not an apples to apples comparison. If you're just looking at financial aid awards, you have to look at what that net cost is going to be at each institution. So in April, as I was mentioning, you want to compare those different award letters. And then May 1st, you want to tell the schools where you're going. What school are you interested in attending? You are going to need to make some deposits for our students. And so there is some money that happens up front, some financial aspects of the college going process where financial aid doesn't come into play. It could be everything from paying deposits for room and board to a seat deposit or a tuition deposit where you're holding your space at that particular institution. For a lot of students, depending on their financial situations, there are times when the school can waive the application fee for a student. So students should look out for that opportunity. In June, and no later by the 1st of August, students start to see what they're going to end up owing at that particular school that they've chosen to attend. And then the next year, the cycle begins again. The FAFSA becomes available, and then they want to check their bill for the spring semester. So there are so many different places where students and families can get more information. FAFSA.ed.gov or studentaid.gov is a great resource for students. This is where students can complete the FAFSA. They can also learn everything it is they need to know in regard to the federal financial aid process, federal financial aid available. Studentaid.org is going to serve, studentaid.gov is going to serve as that platform. With the CSS profile, College Board is a great place for students to learn more about completing the CSS profile and which schools need the CSS profile and getting that completed and submitted so that they can be considered for those institutional awards at those private institutions. FinAid.org is a great website that just has a lot of information, including free scholarship searches. I know it's one of those resources and tools we use as financial aid administrators and encourage others to use as well. Daniel mentioned his Money Man blog. This is a financial aid focused blog where you can find information, and then please encourage students to look at each school that they're interested in attending. We all have very comprehensive financial aid websites that offer information on how financial aid is handled at that institution. Today, we're talking generalities, but financial aid is very specific and nuanced at each school. So it's really important that students understand the lay of the land at the schools they choose to attend so that they don't miss anything in that particular school's financial aid process. And then we encourage you all to also be a resource and tool to students and provide them with any information they may need. So we do recognize, and I work with this very closely, one of my areas in my particular office is a area that we refer to as professional judgment. And Daniel alluded to this earlier, and that's when a financial aid administrator has the right to exercise his or her professional judgment based on a unique situation that a student may be facing. So what happens through unique situations? In this particular case, if a student is a ward of the court emancipated in a legal guardianship or a homeless or unaccompanied youth, the student would answer those questions on the FAFSA that would grant them an independent financial aid status. However, there are some times when a student has a more complicated familial situation that isn't covered on the FAFSA. So as Daniel alluded to earlier, this could be either abuse or neglect, or there are times when a student may not be in a legal guardianship, but there have been some changes in custody in terms of who is primarily responsible for the student, and that person may not be considered a FAFSA parent. So there are a variety of different situations where we take into account the student's unique situation along with third-party documentation to support the student's situation. And then we take into account those situations individually and render a decision on whether or not that student can be deemed independent for financial aid purposes. Next slide. So a couple of things. What if a student is a citizen, but their parents do not have a social security number? So if a student is a financial aid eligible citizen and the parent may not be a citizen of the United States, whether that parent is an undocumented individual or if that parent lives in another country, then the student can complete the FAFSA, and the parent would then complete the FAFSA using all zeros for that parent's social security number. And so then the next question is, what students who are non-citizens are eligible for financial aid? So to be very clear, financial aid is given to students who are typically permanent residents or citizens of the United States, but there are specific instances where a non-resident can receive financial aid, and that includes refugee status, asylee status, Haitian or Cuban entrant, battered immigrant status. Daniel, am I missing any right now? I'm trying to read them off the top of my head.
No, I think that's most. I would just say a reminder that, and I think often people get confused in thinking that if I'm not a citizen, then I'm not eligible. But there are categories of what are called, to your point, eligible non-citizen, and that includes green card, right? So permanent resident. I mean, often people who are permanent resident might think, oh, I'm not qualified, and in fact they are. So I sort of put it into multiple categories. They're citizens, they're eligible non-citizens, to your point. They're ineligible non-citizens who can still apply for financial aid at their individual colleges. But in your good point, I think you've covered most of the sort of eligible non-citizen categories.
Right. And then what is the difference between an eligible non-citizen and DACA student? So our DACA students are not eligible for federally funded student aid. And so when a student is a DACA student or a dreamer, that student may want to complete the FAFSA and they can. However, they're not going to qualify for federal aid. The reason why they may want to complete the FAFSA is depending on the institution that they're attending. They may be able to receive institutional resources at that particular college or university, and the FAFSA might be the application that that institution utilizes. So there are cases where our DACA students do want to complete the FAFSA. But quite frankly, when it comes to federal aid, DACA students are not going to be eligible for any type of federally funded student aid. And so what I will encourage DACA students to take into account are those private resources available. Typically for private scholarships, if the private scholarship does not explicitly indicate that it is for a permanent resident or citizen, then I would encourage students in other statuses to apply. And additionally, there is a specific scholarship for our DACA students called the Dream US Scholarship. And the Dream US Scholarship is specifically for those students who are in a dreamer status. And so I'll share that in the chat shortly. And so I did mention a bit about professional judgment before, and I was speaking in the terms of a dependency override when we take into account a student's unique situation. But there are other ways that financial aid administrators can exercise your professional judgment. And one of those ways is if a family situation has drastically changed since the information provided on the FAFSA. And so as Daniel mentioned, the FAFSA does use information from what ends up being 2 years prior to that particular aid year. And there is a lot that can happen in 2 years. There are times when there are shifts in the family's economic situation and income has been reduced. There are times when the household situation has changed and maybe there has been a change in the parent or student's marital status, or a change in the number of individuals because someone has recently passed away. And so there are times when we as financial aid administrator can take these unique situations into account through the professional judgment process. What I will share with you is each and every institution has their own professional judgment process. So it's really important for students in these situations to reach out directly to the college or university so that the college or university can help them navigate what the process looks like at that particular institution and allow them to begin that process and move forward. So what happens if the parent of a dependent student is unwilling to provide parental data? This can allow us as financial aid administrators to take a look at the student's file, knowing that some parents refuse to complete the FAFSA and refuse to provide any economic support and any economic information to the students. It's really important, again, for the student to reach out to their financial aid office because each of these processes are going to be unique to the institution the student is attending. However, I want to note that in these cases, when a student has parental refusal to assist them economically and parental refusal to assist them with the FAFSA, the only type of aid for which a student will qualify is the unsubsidized loan. The unsubsidized loan does begin accruing interest once it disperses. So optimally, if a student is able to get parental data, that's what they want to do. However, we do recognize there are some complex situations that may not qualify for a dependency override, but may fit into this category. And so then in the situation where a student has maybe been abused or neglected by a parent, this is when a dependency override comes into play. And we do see very complicated familial situations in this area. It is important for the student to recognize that while their account is important for the financial aid administrator to understand what's taken place, for these dependency overrides, we do typically need third-party documentation. They come in a variety of different forms: police reports, information from the Department of Children and Families, social worker reports, guidance counselors, other individuals close to the situations who are able to share what the student's situation and circumstances have been. Next slide. So that is the end of the formal part of our presentation, and we know there are lots of questions coming through the Q&A. I am going to take a breath and we'll go ahead and get started.
So I'll say there are a couple of things that came through that I'm going to answer quickly, Karina, if you don't mind. So one of them was a question about sort of how does, and I can ask it, you can answer, I can answer, but how does the Florida prepaid sort of fit into this? And I know often, there's a question about Bright Futures. Is Florida prepaid a scholarship program? Is it not? How does it sort of count in the way we handle this? Do you want to address that question?
Sure. So are you all hearing me? I feel like I'm getting a delay on mine.
Yeah,
okay, great.
We are.
Okay, so Florida prepaid is typically, we consider it a financial resource, but it's typically a financial resource that is purchased on the student's behalf, either by their parent or another family member. So it is not financial aid in the vast majority of cases. I will have a caveat. There are some students who have received Florida prepaid as a part of a scholarship. And in those cases, financial aid must account for Florida prepaid. Typically speaking, Florida prepaid is that resource available to students that has been purchased on their behalf, and it is separate from their financial aid package. So a student can have Florida prepaid and Bright Futures. A student can have Florida prepaid and a variety of other scholarships, and they work in tandem. They work hand in hand. A student doesn't have to make a decision to use Florida prepaid over Bright Futures or the other way around. So one of the things I like to share with students and families is, as long as your scholarship is not tuition specific. So there are some scholarships that are specific for tuition, but if you have Florida prepaid, what will happen is Florida prepaid will go towards the student's tuition and fees. Florida prepaid never pays 100% of the student's tuition and fees, regardless of what parents think they're getting into when they purchase the plan. That's not what it does, but it does pay in most instances the vast majority of tuition and fees at a given institution. And then what happens is any other financial resources are applied to the additional debt the student may have. So for example, if a student has Florida prepaid and Bright Futures, Florida prepaid is going to be applied to those tuition and fees. If Bright Futures is available to that student or other financial resources are available, it's then going to go to the other charges on the student's account. And depending on the type of institution the student is attending, there could be a variety of different charges. So using UCF as an example, at UCF, when a student has Florida prepaid and there's remaining tuition balance remaining, the next resource available is going to go to the remaining outstanding tuition. Now, while all students will have tuition, not all students will have all of the other charges at UCF. So a student may also have housing charges. A student may have participated in one of our book purchase programs. A student may have a meal plan. That's not the case at all institutions. But while while Bright Futures is based on the number of credit hours a student takes, it doesn't necessarily have to go to tuition. So the remaining Bright Futures, can go towards any other item on the student's account, or can be issued as a refund for the student if they don't have other items to use for their other educational expenses that are making up the cost of attendance.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really helpful because often people get confused. I think, again, my takeaway for families often is, well, Bright Futures is based on your tuition amount. It's not limited to paying tuition only. And that's often a mistake that families make. The next question I saw, maybe I'll tackle this one, is the NIL question. How does NIL figure into financial aid packages? So for those of you who don't know, the NCAA recently made a ruling that allowed for name, image, likeness compensation. So what that means is a student athlete who's at a Division I institution or any institution might wind up with compensation where they're paid by an external company to do work related to their name, image, and likeness. So they might appear in a television commercial, or they might have a billboard or whatever. The NIL, the name, image, likeness amount is not a financial aid award, it's an income source. So in that situation, that income from the NIL agreement would be part of that student's income in the year it was received. So it won't have impact necessarily on this year's aid, but it could have impact in the future for the year in which the aid is based on that tax year. Remember, we're 2 years behind. So if I'm a new student in 2023, I'm using my 2021 taxes. Right. And if, let's say, I get money for NIL in 23, that's not going to show up until I do my 25-26 FAFSA, because we're always 2 years behind on the income side. So that's just an answer about the NIL piece. So What other questions do we have?
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, we have some questions coming through, and if it doesn't get answered live, feel free to drop it in the chat. We have volunteers as well who'd be able to answer. I see another question has come up a few times along with Florida prepaid. Can that go towards the EFC as well?
Yeah, essentially, so to Kareem's good point, when you use your Florida prepaid, you're using it in a sense in paying your EFC. It is under that category of past income or savings. It's a savings program. So, you could use your savings account, you could use your stocks or bonds, you could use, equity from your home. You could also use your Florida prepaid program as sort of a way to help pay that EFC. It is past income or savings. It's not counted as a financial aid program. It really is based on that, that use of it as cash, in a sense, a way to pay the bill, part of that EFC.
Okay, wonderful. And I guess another question that we had come through from the registration questions is, when students fill out the FAFSA, how can they avoid errors while completing it? So if we know sometimes these errors can be easily avoided, but what happens if there are errors in the meantime? How can they fix that as well?
So I would say the first thing that I would encourage students and families to do is use the IRS data retrieval tool. And so that's going to be one of the ways to eliminate any errors, because it's going to be coming directly from the IRS. And so there's a lot of financial information to input on the FAFSA. And if you're doing that line by line from a tax return, it's easy to make an error. So that would be the first thing that I would encourage students and families to do. And the second thing is really just read through the question fully, because sometimes we get students and families that are assuming that they're answering a question one way and they just probably didn't read it the right way. One example that I think of that we get a lot in our office is that we get a lot of first year students indicating that they're graduate students. And so it's kind of an educational moment to teach students that, while you are graduating from high school, you're actually entering as you're in an undergraduate program. And so just kind of getting that clarity, having students read the questions in their entirety and have an understanding of what they're answering, I think is also important.
I'll add two things. Number one, I think often people misread the you and your. So the FAFSA is written, provide your social security number. Remember, every time it refers to you and your, it's talking about the student. And what do we know about 18-year-olds? I mean, I love 18-year-olds. I had two of them at one point in my life, but generally they're not the ones who are driving the financial aid application. That's a generalization. So often it's the parents who are. And sometimes I've seen parents confuse the you and your for themselves. So they'll enter their income where the student income should be, or they'll enter their social security number where the student social security number should be. So really pay attention to the you and your, I think, is really critical. The other thing I'll say is your question talked about corrections. So it is possible that someone's going to make an error. That happens. Right. With the FAFSA, there is a process to correct the FAFSA. So once you process your FAFSA, the information gets sent to the central data repository. From there, it's pulsed out to the colleges that are listed on the FAFSA application, and we receive those data. But a family can then log in, usually 3 to 5 days later, and initiate a correction if necessary. So, oops, I just realized I listed $1 million when I went to be $1,000 instead. They can log in and correct that, and then that correction will be pulsed out to the colleges as well. Sometimes we make corrections. So when we make corrections from the financial aid office, we send it to the central repository, and that information is pulsed out to everyone, including the student. So corrections are a part of the process as well. So there will be multiple transactions that take place over time.
Okay, good to know. And I guess that also can tag along with, what is a submitted FAFSA versus a completed FAFSA? Does that get in the way with that as well?
So yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things here. So one of them is that often students get stuck around the signature process. So you can submit a FAFSA but not complete it because you haven't turned in paper signatures, if that's where you're going to go. Again, our advice is not to do it by paper, to do it electronic, but there is an option, especially if a student's doing this and doesn't have their parents with them, to print a page, have the parents sign it and mail it. Often that may be the difference between a submitted and a completed as well. And then it could be a time frame issue in terms of the process and time frame. Any other advice on that, Karima?
No, I would definitely agree with everything that you said in terms of that. And then also there are times when a FAFSA is submitted and rejected because there is information that has gone through the central processor's process. And through that process, there's information that's needed in order for the FAFSA to be submitted completely and given to the institution. So it's also important for students to ensure if they have a rejected FAFSA that they take the necessary steps to make the appropriate corrections so that the institution can receive the record of their FAFSA.
Wonderful. Okay. We also have a question here. Do you have any good resources for financial aid information in other languages? The FAFSA itself can be translated, but the FAQ pages can't necessarily. So what are some other resources we may be able to provide parents and students to complete the FAFSA?
So I know that for us, depending on the demographic of certain schools, we actually will provide, we have done Spanish speaking FAFSA nights as well as Haitian Creole speaking FAFSA nights with members of our team who speak those languages. So I think that that's something that as financial aid administrators, we recognize that there are times when receiving information in one's native language makes this information a little bit easier to digest and be able to understand. So I know that that's one of the things that we do in our office. When requested, we will provide financial aid nights or at least have an individual on our team based on the demographic to provide answers to families who may be more comfortable with getting the information that way.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And we'll also provide more resources at the end of the session, some handouts and resources that FGAN has on our specific website for filling out the FAFSA and any other things that students and parents may need to know as well. Something else that also came through is when, I know Karima, you may have mentioned this, but maybe just dive in a little bit deeper. When do Florida colleges and universities typically send out financial aid packages, and how do they notify the students? Sometimes it may slip through the cracks and the students may not realize that it was sent out, or they may not realize they missed a deadline or anything like that. So maybe elaborate a little bit.
Sure. So when financial aid offices send out packages, it varies from one school to the next. I would say that those packages typically start going out in March and continue through March through April for those initial packages. And they continue to happen throughout the admission cycle as students, depending on the institution, different schools have different admission processes. If a school has a rolling admissions as students are getting admitted, more financial aid packages are being sent out throughout the duration of the admission cycle. The way in which students receive their award notifications or their financial aid summaries is what we will refer to them as, depends on the institution. A lot of our schools have moved to electronic notification. So I would encourage students to be very actively looking in their email, utilizing that school's portal to see any information that may be sent to them, because the vast majority of schools have moved away from paper. However, some schools do send a hard copy of that student's financial aid summary. So it really depends on the institution. So it's really important for the student to know their particular institutions that they're interested in, those processes. What I would share is that students can visit the financial aid website of the school that they're interested in attending and learn more about how that school notifies their students of their financial aid packages.
Wonderful. All great stuff. So students can realize when their financial aid packages are coming in so they don't miss out on anything.
There are a couple of questions that came in that I'm seeing in the chat. I just want to make sure we capture those. One, there was a question that someone had about whether the 24-25 FAFSA will require both parent signatures. I just want to be clear, we don't have any guidance that says that. So again, the FAFSA requires one parent to sign and the student. For dependent students. For independent students, it's just the student. But for dependent students, it's the student plus one parent. I don't have any indication that's changing. Nothing we've read or heard would adjust that. What might change is which parent is required to sign. So again, for divorced or separated families, as we talked about, there could be an adjustment in terms of which parent is the parent for the FAFSA. So just to be aware of that starting in 24-25. Also, there was a question about the matrix. You mentioned a matrix to stay organized. I can give an example of what I might think of, but I don't know if you have a suggestion, Karima, of how you might format it as well.
Sure. When I speak with students, I share with them a timeline. And so they have a timeline of what those things are by calendar, basically. So priority filing dates that are coming up, deadlines for submission of documentation. And I would limit it to those schools that they're most interested in, because to some extent, you want to start broad and narrow it down. If you continue to keep everything in the sphere of what you're looking at, it can be very overwhelming. So as the students are going through the process and narrowing down their options, I think it's important that they narrow that matrix as well. So they're only focusing on those institutions that they're most interested in attending. And mine is a simple timeline. And it would say, December and whatever's happening in December, then moving on to January and whatever's happening in January. Looks a little bit like a Gantt chart, I guess, kind of a flow chart, or whatever works best for the student. I think that, we all organize differently and think differently. So, if for some students, it might simply be creating a chart like that, but then let's be honest, our students are digital natives. So it might not be a chart at all. It might be a calendar that they utilize within some app on their phone that allows them to keep track of whatever it is that they need to do. So whatever works best for the student, what I would encourage them to do is have a space for where they're able to get that information readily available to them, whatever works best for them.
Wonderful, great advice. So students keep track of every deadline, since there may be some that come through a lot through senior year and some may slip through the cracks.
There was one other question I just want to make sure we answered as well, if you don't mind. So question about private out-of-state, or actually private universities or out-of-state universities, and the use of the Florida prepaid. So just want to be clear, Florida prepaid, if you're in the program, one of the benefits of the program is sort of guaranteeing the cost of tuition, right? So when you do the prepaid program, the idea is you're paying for tomorrow's tuition at today's rate. So if I pay 100% of today's cost for my 6-year-old at UCF, I would get 100% of the cost when they're 18 if they go to UCF, right? So that's the sort of tagline and benefit of the program. I will say what's interesting is tuition hasn't risen at UCF. When was the last time you guys raised tuition at UCF, Karima?
Ooh, years. I cannot remember. It's
been
a long time.
Right. So because of the political reality of Florida, our state colleges and universities aren't raising their tuition. So that benefit's great in a future where that might be reality, and who knows what will be coming. If a student decides, I'm going to go out of state, or I'm going to go to a private institution, they don't get that benefit of the locked-in tuition. However, they can still use the program. So the program does have a cash value per credit hour that it pays at those institutions. So I don't want to get into the particular dollar value because that varies, and it varies by year and all of those things. But I would advise families, or you talking to families who are in that situation, to go to the website, myfloridaprepaid.com, where it's got all the information about that. So the value of the benefit can be applied at any institution in the country, even if it's out of state, even if it's not a Florida public institution. But the benefit may differ based on where you're attending. So just an FYI, to that, if a family has gone through the prepaid program. By the way, so and I just want to recognize, we have a group of excellent colleagues who are behind the scenes answering all these questions, and their stars. And frankly, any one of them could be on camera and replace Karima and I easily. And one of them just sent me a private message. There haven't been tuition increases in the state university system for 10 years. So it's been a long time since the last tuition increase at the state university system level.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, great things. I know another thing that I wanted to touch on, since we get this question all the time, is how do we get parents to provide the information to students? Do you have any advice to encourage students and families to complete this, even if they may think they may not qualify? How do you go about that?
You get a loan, and you get a loan, and you get a loan. I'm being Oprah. So, Karima, do you want to start, and then I'll explain what I
Sure.
mean by that.
So what I normally do when I'm speaking to students and families is I do encourage all students and families to complete the FAFSA. And there are a variety of reasons. One reason is there are some scholarships that utilize the FAFSA to determine eligibility, even if they're not need-based scholarships. So that's normally a selling point that resonates with parents. The other reason that I think it's important for a FAFSA to be on file is that sometimes a family situation can change. So you may think, yeah, I know I'm not going to qualify for any gift aid. I know I'm not going to get any grants, and we do not plan on taking these loans. However, something happens, something changes, and you do need to get that loan. And so instead of starting the process from scratch, waiting for the school to get that information from the FAFSA, and then starting the loan process, at least the FAFSA is on file, and then you can move forward. So those are some of the scenarios that I share with students and families to encourage FAFSA completion. Daniel, is there anything else you would share?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say is I make the analogy, it's a little bit, so I often hear from families, I don't want to do the FAFSA because I don't want to pay. Well, okay, so the reality is, first of all, the whole point of the FAFSA is to measure what you can afford. So if you can't afford it, that's going to be documented by the FAFSA, right? That's the point of applying for financial aid. So, to go through the process is really important to document that concern. That's number one. Number two, I would say, I also make the analogy, it's kind of like applying for a mortgage versus actually starting to accept and sign the legal documents to actually take the money. So in a sense, filling out the FAFSA does nothing to you. There's no risk to you. You're not obligating yourself to pay for anything. All you're doing, and this is when, again, that new term student aid index becomes important. All you're doing really is measuring whether you're eligible for aid. You're not saying, I then commit to paying the rest. So, with families, I often have that conversation to say, listen, it's really about applying and determining eligibility. If you don't like the answer, we're not specifying who will pay for what. That's up to you and your family, and you may decide you can't afford it. But how do you know if you can't afford it if you don't even apply? So that's usually my best response. And then I also will say the last piece, sorry, as I said, a loan for you, a loan for you. We do have in this program a guaranteed student loan. We used to call it the guaranteed student loan. Now it really is guaranteed, right? And that means that any family, regardless of income, can qualify for a small student loan to help offset some of the expense. I am a believer, and I have two kids who've gone through the financial aid programs as well. I am a believer in having students have some fiscal interest in their own education. I think it's important for us as students and parents to encourage students to take some fiscal responsibility for the education they're receiving. Not money that's going to be overwhelming, not money that's going to be something they can't afford to repay. But in the first year, borrowing $3,500 seems reasonable to me to help cover the expense up to $3,500 as necessary. So right now, by going through the FAFSA, students can qualify for an unsubsidized or subsidized direct loan, actually in their first year up to a total of $5,500. But again, that's the only way they can qualify for that is by going through the application process.
Right. All great advice. You never know what you can qualify for until you fill it out. So it's best to do it right when it opens on October 1st, just to see and figure it out from there as well. One of the things I also wanted to mention was the FSA ID. This is one of the first few steps when filling out the FAFSA and completing it. We need an FSA ID. But are there any tips to making the process easier? Some families or students may lose their FSA ID and then can't get back in, and this process alone stops them from completing it. So what are some things students and families can do so they don't lose that or forget about that information as well?
So what I would say is if a student or another person completing the FAFSA or parent misplaces their information or forgets it, it's easily retrievable. When they're on the FSA ID webpage, they can indicate that they forgot their password. It will go to the email address that they've provided, and they can answer a few questions and get right back into the system. So it's relatively easy to recover that information and be up and running again.
Can I also say, make sure to link up your mobile number, because you may change your email address, but if you have your mobile number and your email address, you have at least, hopefully, one way to be in touch. So, hey, Karima, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
I do see that there is a question about, or a follow-up to, one family say they make too much money to complete the FAFSA. And I think Daniel's point about having the loan availability, as well as what I mentioned before about some scholarships that aren't even need-based, using the FAFSA to, or requiring a FAFSA even if they're not looking at the information. So I think that's one of those selling points as well.
There are a couple of logistical pieces that are coming up, and I just want to again remind people, we are going to have a copy of the recording of this session posted to the FCAN webpage shortly, and a copy of the presentation itself posted. So people can feel assured that they will be able to get access to all the information we presented today in the handout, as well as a copy of the recording itself.
Yes, we will definitely share that out. And if you registered today, we will send out an email to all you guys as well with the recording and the slides, so you can access that whenever you need to. Okay, we have about 10 more minutes until we can wrap up, but just going through a few more questions that we got through the registration. How do we also assist students in foster care and undocumented students? I know in the chat we dropped the dream.us website, so you can go there to find scholarships for students as well. But what are some other resources we can provide these students so they're not missing out on the financial aid that's available for them? Because some of these students, they may not even know what's available to them until they're presented with it as well.
So I would say one of the things, and again, as a former state college employee, there are waivers that exist within the system as well, especially for students who were in foster care or coming out of foster care programs. There are some fantastic programs that are available for tuition waivers at our state universities and state colleges in Florida. So, again, keeping in mind, there may be other aspects or other benefits that aren't necessarily typical financial aid availability, but those programs can be available. That said, a student should still avail themselves of the financial aid application system to supplement what they might receive in terms of a waiver or some other source.
I would also say, I know that at our institution and at many others, there is a foster youth liaison that can help students who've aged out of the foster care system navigate higher ed in general. And so I think ensuring that students get connected with that individual or that office on their campus so that they are getting fully supported and preparing them for the best success that they can have at that particular institution.
Right. I will also say that FCAN hosted a webinar on students in foster care and undocumented students with financial aid resources, college application information, and anything else you may need for those students as well. So you can find that on the FCAN website in case you need to reference that. I also wanted to ask, what advice can you give to freshmen to start the conversation about the FAFSA? We know that's too early for them to be submitting a FAFSA, but how can you get this information in their minds so they don't forget it by the time it's actually senior year? Is freshman year too early, or should they always be thinking about it in the background?
I would say freshman year is not too early, but I think when I speak to audiences of high school students that are not seniors, I'm very mindful of the amount of information I provide and the type of information I'm providing, because we don't want to overwhelm them and they're not going to necessarily remember that information. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, financial aid is ever changing. So I think there are a variety of different ways that we inform students that there is a process, it's coming down the pike. I also encourage students to start applying for scholarships that early. There are scholarships available as early as elementary school where students can start to get some of their funding for college. And so I think having a conversation that is pertinent to where they are, though. So, telling them all the information about this year's FAFSA is not going to be what they need in freshman year, but reminding them that they are eligible to start looking for scholarships, reminding them that when they become a senior, there is a free application for federal student aid, reminding them of the qualifications needed to secure bright futures because they are already working towards that. Those are things that I think are really pertinent at that time versus, giving them a lot of information on the application process per se. That's what I would say.
And I would say doing research on net price calculators, right? Even beginning in freshman year to start, it's early, but start working on a college list. What does that look like? I think, part of the question is for some freshmen, even thinking about college, it sounds so foreign, right? 4 years away, like beginning to take a college visit if possible, even in the local community. Go visit a state college, go visit a local university, public or private, just to get a sense of what that looks like and feels like, to begin to understand what that transition is going to be. I know I never visited the college I attended before I attended there, and that was a mistake. I will admit. So, had I had the chance to go to an admitted student weekend, I probably would have had a better sense of the college. I may not have gone to the college I ultimately chose, but having a chance to get to sample what that looks like and what that feels like is really important, because it's not, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's not like, what you see on TV or movies, and having a real experience, I think is meaningful.
Right. There are a bunch of resources everywhere for freshmen to just explore career pathways, what colleges are out there. And of course, that plan may change, which is okay, but it's just getting the process and getting them thinking about the process and what there is to come and what potentially they could be doing by the time senior year comes. Okay.
I will say the other thing is, and we didn't talk about this, but I'll just mention it. If you're committed to a particular institution by the time you come along, right, and you get, this is not quite the question you asked, but I think it's important to mention. Don't forget about early decision or early action as an admissions plan, especially at private not-for-profit institutions. I know, and I'll share this with you all here, right? Individual institutions have different admissions rates based on the admit category you're coming into. You may be more likely to get in an early decision, early action than you would in a regular decision, because that institution knows you're committed to them for attendance. So really important that you think about that. At for example, we also have what we call our premier scholarships, which are our top merit scholarships. They could pay full tuition, they could pay full cost. They're only available to folks who apply early admission or early decision. So early action, early decision. So really important to think about that as well, if you're committed to a particular institution.
Right. And I would also piggyback on that if you're interested in a school, regardless of the type of school. Merit funding at many institutions, it's not, there's a finite amount. So if a student is interested in attending that institution, they do want to apply early. I've seen students who have great credentials, but at that point, those funds have been exhausted and they're later in the admission cycle. So just ensuring that they are really diligent about applying to those schools they're most interested in the early admission process or early in the admission cycle. And each school has their own process for admission.
Wonderful. Great advice for students to keep in mind going forward. We also have one more question in the chat. Someone is mentioning they are hosting a FAFSA event for their high school. There are resources available from FAFSA to provide assistance, such as advisors, to help families through the application one-on-one.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding, are they asking, does the association support outreach events? Or are they asking for resources to assist with their outreach events, such as those resources provided by the Department of Education? I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
So it's mentioning FAFSA, so FAFSA. Are there resources available from FAFSA to provide assistance, such as advisors to help with the application one-on-one? So, if you know any from there.
I would actually, Mr. Hernandez, I'm going to throw you into the mix here. I know our partners with the Office of Student Financial Assistance at the state, the Florida Department of Education. They are instrumental in connecting the high schools with financial aid administrators to assist with outreach. So if that's what the person is looking for, I would definitely make that connection through OSFA to get support for financial aid outreach. In terms of resources and tools available, I think there are a lot of things out here that students and families can utilize. One of the things that I like to use, FSA has a really great YouTube channel that has some interesting interactive and I would say engaging, maybe not interactive, but engaging videos that, students relate to. So there are a variety of different ways to share this information and disseminate the information. But if you're looking for support for an outreach event, the Office of Student Financial Assistance at the Florida Department of Education does support that type of initiative.
I also just posted to the question, there's a PowerPoint that the feds have put together of each screen within the FAFSA itself. So I've posted that link to the question as well. If people want to download that, they can. It does go screen by screen through the FAFSA and show each of those questions. We're going to be covering this, and this may be a time to do a little bit of a commercial. We're going to be doing a walkthrough for you all about this topic, walking through every screen by screen question on the FAFSA. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that is a week from Friday that we're doing that session. So folks can register for that. And again, we'll have a recording of that where Kareem and I will actually walk through question by question the FAFSA and make sure people understand what the FAFSA is asking for and why it's asking it that particular way.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we'll do that for our counselors, and we're also going to do that for our students and families. So
right. Yep. Florida Virtual College Week will have an open presentation, and you're doing that one, I think, on your own, Karima.
I am.
Yes, but we'll do one for students and parents as well. So that may be a resource. The last thing I'd say is to Jennifer, who asked this question, reach out to your local college and university to see if they might be able to assist with resources. Many of us are very busy, but we do make a priority, as you heard from Karima and from me, in supporting, this process as best we can. So while, usually not a great use of all of our time to all be there at the same time. So Karima and I probably would not show up together to a workshop. It may be helpful to have, if we can support this, your local college or university may be able to provide a staff member to assist in doing this kind of presentation. Or doing a one-off event. So, again, feel free to reach out there too.
Also, Daniel, I would chime in with, I am seeing a lot of districts do district-wide remote opportunities for students. I think in the wake of post-pandemic life, we've learned some things. And one of the things that we learned is that for some students and families, having remote sessions just makes it more accessible and easily available for students and families to join. So I am seeing some more cohesive efforts to have things at district-wide levels as well. So those are also great opportunities to get a lot of individuals the help that they need in one session.
Yes, there's definitely resources out there. And I will just share my screen again since we are close to time, but I will also share the resources that we were mentioning earlier. Here we have the top 5 reasons to complete a FAFSA handout if you need a few key messages to encourage students to complete the form. What you need to complete the FAFSA handout lists multiple documents students need to have ready with them while they complete the form. On this, there's also a section where students and parents can save their FSA ID so they don't lose that, since we were mentioning that as well. This is also available in Spanish. Lastly, we also have the common FAFSA mistakes handout that goes over a few more resources that students don't make the mistakes that they have on the FAFSA, such as missing date of birth, incorrect information, or other information that can be easily avoided. This is also available in Spanish. We are also working with our partners, as we mentioned, with a FAFSA walkthrough session for students and parents that will be on October 19th from 6 to 7 p.m. Registration is open, so you can let your students and parents know they can see an example of filling out the FAFSA step by step. We'll be sharing this in upcoming newsletters and on our website as well, and I could send it out in the email that will be going out with this as well. On this page, you can also find other college one-on-one sessions for students and families. On September 22nd, we will have an apply session going over the college application process. And on September 29th, we will have Karima back, and she will have a fun session going over financial aid and scholarship opportunities for students. And then along with that, like we mentioned, we will have a FAFSA walkthrough for counselors. The session will be on September 30th, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. So the previous session is for students. This one is specifically for counselors, and registration is on FCAN's website, and I'll send that through our newsletters and emails as well, so you guys can register for that. And you haven't already done so, I encourage you to register for the College Ready Florida initiatives at floridacollegeaccess.org/initiatives. And to ensure you don't miss any upcoming webinars, promising practices, or policy briefs, please feel free to subscribe to FCAN at floridacollegeaccess.org/subscribe. And many thanks to Daniel and Karima and our chat volunteers for sharing their knowledge with us today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Karima.